welcome to everyone who's joining today. Yeah, as Stacy mentioned, we're going to talk about information flows today. It's a, I shouldn't say margin, it's a tangential topic to digitization, and since this is the Digital Futures platform. So I'm definitely going to put this into the scope of how digital tools are influencing this. It's based on our research project, ongoing research project now that's been funded by Energimyndigheten within the Design for Energieffektiv Vardag research program. So it's a really interesting program to be a part of because it is focused more on design. For sort of an engineering group like us, it's a really interesting place to be. So hopefully you will agree. So just to make sure everyone's clear that I oftentimes use the initials PV as if everyone knows what they are, but just to make sure, PV is meaning shorthand for photovoltaic, which are these types of solar panels. They are the ones you're probably most familiar with that make electricity, not the ones that make hot water, but just going to sort of make sure that that's clear right up front. And if we look at sort of what our challenges are in the world of sort of prosumer PV, so prosumer is a word meaning producer and consumer. So this is like a new world where all of us are potentially not just using electricity, but also making it, usually through the use of PV. But getting more and more people to do this is challenging because energy and sustainability in general are very complex and confusing subjects. And so oftentimes people are not entirely sure what to do and what actions to take. This then leads to a very long and often expensive process for people to adopt solar cells or PV. There's a long educational process, almost like you can imagine sort of buying a car for the first time. So there's this can be somewhat of a challenge both for researchers like us or even companies as well. And then from the user perspective, it can also be somewhat difficult to find information, or once you do find it, it's oftentimes kind of boring or potentially even biased. And so we'll definitely be reviewing and discussing some of that today. So within our project, our sort of overarching goal, well, I put this statement here as sort of one of our main goals, where it's to provide users, and in this case, user meaning consumers or the villa owners, for example, with better heuristics for complex decision-making, while also nudging them towards sustainable choices. And so there's kind of a lot here. I mean, ultimately, our goal is to have more solar panels on more roofs, because that's kind of helping us meet a lot of our environmental goals. But again, the core topic in our project is sort of about how we get information to them to help them make not only more effective decisions, but also sort of leveraging some of their tendencies to make sure we get them to the decision that we think they want to make. Bit of a messy way of saying that, perhaps, but ultimately this can boil down to sort of what information are users interested in and how should we deliver that information to them. And this is beneficial not only for the users, but hopefully also the people selling the solar cells, because ultimately these two are interlinked and need to work together. Okay, so on the agenda today, I'm going to hit on three main points from our work. So first, we're going to sort of have a bit of a tour of what it's like for users looking for information online about PV systems and sort of some of the challenges and limitations of that. Then we'll take a step back and sort of look at the overall experience of buying PV systems, not just the online part, so we can sort of put it into perspective on sort of the whole picture and some of the sort of important factors and risks at the sort of industry scale. And then I'll go at the last bit, I'll talk about sort of what we're developing within our project and how we aim to actually make this better for everyone. Before I do that, I want to just sort of give a shout out to all the great companies that we're working with. So Betin de Labit, Ida Lemoyne at Betin de Labit, they're a behavioral design firm, and they're our main research partner on this one. So like I said, we are coming from more of an engineering background, and so can really handle the technical stuff quite well. But her and her team there have been really great in sort of getting the social aspect done in a good way, and a lot of good design work. So it's been really nice collaborating in that sense. We also had a lot of help from Lisebergs Villaförening in southern Stockholm, where they were helping us with workshops and getting connected with people on the ground. And then I'll show you some examples later on of the websites that we're helping develop. So Terens is, you probably all know, that large engineering consultancy. They actually developed a lot of the early solar map tools in about 10 years ago for municipalities. And so we're working with them as well as Karlstad's commune to update their maps and make them better. So, and we'll get more into that later on. But I wanted to at least, give a quick shout out to all the great companies that we've been working with the last year and a half, 2 years or so. So let's start by just kind of going over what kind of web tools are out there and how this can look from the user's perspective. So our user today is going to be Anna, and she is a Stockholmer that is quite keen to learn more about solar cells and solar PV. This is her house. She lives in Gamla Enskede. This is just this obviously Anna's not a real person. This is just a random house I chose from Stockholm. So don't go looking for Anna. But I'm trying to make this a fun sort of adventure story at least. And so Anna, she knows that she's got a nice sunny roof that is quite open and might be a good candidate. So now she's going to go online and try and find out, okay, what potential does she actually have, both from generating electricity standpoint as well as sort of how it's going to be for her economically. So, first step for a lot of us in searching for information is to get on the Googles. And so she gets in there and finds out that there is an awful lot of information out there, for one. There's also a lot of companies that are quite happy to get your attention. And so she's got this long list of different brands that are out there. And so she starts going through the websites to sort of, almost like you could imagine it being like a way of searching for multiple quotes in a way. She's trying to compare different companies' offers and see what she can get. And because Anna is a very diligent consumer, she actually checks all of the possible websites, which is very ambitious of her. But it gives us a nice look at the results of how the whole industry is looking overall. And just to give you a glimpse as to what I'm referring to here with these online tools, so there's a couple different formats, but this one here from Hemsol is a very common style where you start by typing in your address, and then you will select the roof area for your home. And then you start giving the program or the website information to help it calculate the solar generation. So like, which direction are you facing? How steep is your roof? So these are all factors that impact your total PV generation. You also need to tell it how much electricity you use in a year. That can limit the size that you can have. And then there's lots of other things that go into it, like these details, which most people probably just ignore. And then you come up with this dashboard at the end that gives you a lot of information. So you have a few different options for what type of system. There's a lot of economic information like payback time or interest rate that you'll earn, as well as some technical information. So this is the type of tools that we're talking about. And in the last 2 years, they've sprung up. Many companies. In fact, as I was reviewing them, it was quite difficult to even keep track of all the new ones that were coming up. But this is what we're talking about when we're talking about searching for information about solar PV online. And when I went through and looked at all the ones that I could, or Anna, when Anna was looking for them, this is what she found. So what's important here isn't so much the absolute numbers, is what I want to focus on is the large spread of results. So if you take it from the standpoint of Anna is a person with a house that wants PV, and you're just looking for a recommendation of what I should have. When you see recommendations that span, what's it going to cost? Well, could be anywhere between 90 and 150,000 crowns. Like that's a big spread. So kind of unhelpful. Same thing with like, how much is it going to generate? Well, anywhere from 5 to 10,000 kilowatt hours per year. Well, again, also feels a little unhelpful with such a huge and uncertain range. And part of this stems from how the different tools are making their recommendations in terms of like how big they think your roof is, or how big you think your roof is in some cases. And so this can also lead to missizing of the system, because they basically just try to make it as big as possible to fit that area, rather than design it to meet the needs of the load inside the house. And systems are usually sized in kilowatts, but then you can also think of it in terms of panel count. So again, for someone who's trying to visualize what this system will look like on their house, there's a pretty big difference between 16 and 38 panels on your roof. And then these technical factors also tie directly into the economics. So both in terms of the initial cost, but also how much you're going to save, because of course this is connected to how much you're generating, as well as other assumptions, of course, but then also your payback time, which is the metric that most people like to think about. And again, the range from 7 to 18 years is somewhat unhelpful. And so this feels like kind of a mess. And so how does this happen? I talked a little bit about the sizing methods and how they choose the size of the system to recommend to the user. There's also can be quite a significant difference in the economic assumptions. So for example, what type of electricity prices that companies are expecting now and into the future. So that makes a big deal, as well as some of the more critical assumptions that are part of the initial sort of simulation, you could say. So one of the big ones is the initial cost. That has a huge impact on the economics, but also the production, or sort of how much they're simulating will actually be generated, not just on a total basis, but on a sort of normalized or relative basis. And so if we look at these specific values, like what sort of prices, like how much, what's the price per watt? This is a very common metric in PV, is sort of a unit price that you can expect. And this is all happening behind the scenes. Like these are not figures that the websites are providing. These are things that I calculated on my own, because I know that these are important factors. So the user wouldn't necessarily have this information to make comparisons with. So this blue line here on the specific price, this is sort of an average price from market statistics. And you can see that the range is anywhere from 8% above to 20% below this average that's coming out of the websites. So this is one major sort of uncertainty or place where companies may be able to shift their assumptions a little bit. The other one is the generation. And so on the right-hand graph here, so this is kilowatt hours per kilowatt, which is the yield of the PV system, again, normalized. And we see here in blue, this is a simulation that I've run as part of just my own work. And you can see that the range here is anywhere from plus 22% to 11% below. And of course, I'm not trying to say that my simulation is the correct one, but if you through all the years of working on this stuff, you sort of get an idea for what different models produce, and also what the statistics say. So I mean, 1035, which would be right here, that's pretty typical depending on the model and the assumptions you make about the weather. But if we look at the actual production of systems in Stockholm County, they're usually quite a bit lower, so down in this 800 range. Okay, so again, I'm not trying to like get too stuck up on the numbers or stuck into the numbers here. Again, just focusing on how much uncertainty or how much variability there is in sort of the values that these tools are using. And so what would be really fantastic if there was some sort of a authority of sorts that could be a benchmark. So how does the user know about this stuff? I mean, they're not a researcher like myself who can dig into the statistics. They just need a way to sort of validate that what they're being told is true. Energimyndigheten is actually a great resource for this. They have a fantastic website called Pollen. It's a one-stop shop for all things regarding sort of the process, the regulations, as well as they have this nice calculator that you see sort of the animation on the right. And so users can go here and do some calculations themselves. And there's a lot of factors that are a lot of things about it that are really good. They have all these tooltips that you see kind of popping up that have really nice descriptions of what it is that they're looking at and what maybe like some of the input values, what's normal and what the normal ranges are. And then the users also have the option to slide the sliders. Well, now it's now it's gone away from the animation, but they have this opportunity to play with the inputs a bit and immediately see the feedback and the results. So you can see they're using payback time as their main metric, and then they can play around with these values with some help from them. So it's got a lot of nice features from an interaction and learning standpoint, but the main problem is that it's really hard to compare with the offers from the commercial companies. You have to come to this tool with knowing how much your roof produces already and getting it into this format, this kilowatt hours per kilowatt, for example, this format that is not so normal, at least not from the companies. They don't oftentimes talk about that with users. So, so it can be a little bit hard to integrate into the shopping process. There are other places to get this type of information. So you go another tool out there are called solar maps, and they've been around for a number of years, as I mentioned, where they take 3D data from an entire city, and then you can process every single house and see how much solar radiation is available on that house. So that's fantastically useful. Up until very recently, though, most of these maps just included basic radiation information. So, okay, yes, you can see that so many kilowatt hours per year of radiation hits my roof, but what does that actually mean in terms of how much electricity will I generate, or what's it going to cost to get this? So they've been somewhat limited up until now, until, like I said, within the last year or two, you see some of these maps being updated, but they're still not as, I would say, sophisticated from the standpoint of some of the commercial offerings where they're really trying to dive into and make it feel like an offer, like a quotation. So if we kind of just recap how this has been so far, we have Anna who wants information about her home's potential for solar PV, and she goes out and checks every supplier and third-party source, gets wildly varied results, and that when compared in the aggregate don't really give her much more information than she had to start with, other than she has a bit of a statistics problem to deal with. The trusted government resources that she wants to compare with are not compatible with the offers that she's getting from industry. And now she's spent quite a bit of time dealing with this and is starting to get a bit frustrated. And so taking a step back and looking at it sort of from a higher level perspective, like the researcher's perspective here, we can see that the tools, they are indeed making some kind of calculation. And I think they're all doing it in good faith. I also don't mean to suggest here that people are misleading necessarily. Well, we'll come back to that. They are definitely trying to do some sort of calculation and give an honest estimation of solar production based on what the user has told them. The assumptions do vary quite a bit from tool to tool, as well as the way the information is presented. So this is very difficult for comparison's sake, or can be quite difficult for comparison's sake, but also particularly on the assumption side, if they're hidden particularly, then it's really, really hard to compare if you don't know, if you're not comparing an apples to apples quotation, let's say. I did also notice that some tools are not actually making calculations. They give the impression that they are. They do collect information from the user, but then they don't seem to make use of that information. They just give a generic response. I know this just from testing multiple houses, and you start seeing the identical response from every single house, regardless of the orientation of the roof. So that starts to kind of throw up a red flag that maybe these tools are not actually doing any kind of simulation behind the scenes. And like I said, I don't think anyone's trying to be a bad faith actor here. There are some bugs that I noticed. But some of the assumptions that I saw as well were so extreme that they almost look like bugs, where you're seeing economic results that almost don't seem believable, too good to be true type results. And so looking at this from a broad perspective, you start to see some potential issues with the way that solar PV information is being delivered on the online. But this is just one sort of piece of the puzzle within the broader PV shopping experience for people. So I think it's useful to take another step back and sort of place this online bit within the broader adoption process. So this is the diffusion of innovation model of decision making, originally proposed by Rogers quite a few years ago. I don't remember the exact year, but early 20th century. And the basic idea is it's a linear process, and this is just one of several decision-making models, but it has a very good predictive ability, and it's the one that's most useful for our research process as well. So it's quite linear, with the idea that you start by getting interested in a technology. So that can be you're a particularly innovative person, or in the case of solar, maybe you're concerned about the environment, or there can be some sort of acute trigger as well, like, for example, a new support subsidy that's going to make it economically interesting for you, or maybe a policy is going to disappear, and so you want to get while you can type of a thing. But you have the interested stage. Then you move on to the gaining knowledge, where you start to search for information. And so this can happen through many different channels, whether it's your own personal searching online, like we just looked at. You contact professionals and get their opinion of directly or more personally, as well as, of course, asking social network, sort of the peer effect, right? So other people that may have had an installation done, and what their experience was like. And so then that's the feedback loop we see here, this dotted line. So people who have already gone through this process, and then they feed that information back into others in the system. Finally, you start forming an opinion with, if you get past this process, you start to form an opinion and start getting more detailed information, like specific quotations, lining up financing, as well as sort of dealing with some of the externalities, like maybe like permitting issues or technical compatibility issues, stuff like that. Ultimately, you make the decision, and then you go through the implementation process, where you actually have to execute and get this done. So this is the broad framework, and so it's probably quite clear that we're really working inside of these two phases out of the entire process. So we're relatively limited in the full scope of the process. So I don't want to place too much weight on these online calculators, because there's other factors as well. People are concerned with how they're going to look. Of course, they don't want their house to be ugly afterwards. They want the process to be easy as well. That comes to the sort of installation part of it. They don't want to spend too much time or mental effort on this. So there's some recent reports that are coming out now about how people are buying PV that have been really quite, in Sweden specifically, and it's really quite interesting to see that for most, and this is not for everyone, but for most people, what they oftentimes will do is they've got the interest and they're starting to look around. They'll get recommendations. They'll talk to their neighbors or their friends who have either searched themselves or have gone through the process, and they'll get a recommendation for specific companies. And they might also potentially attend a seminar. So this was something that we participated in with the Lisebergs Villaforening, where there's one or two people in the community who are champions of a technology, and they're trying to convince their neighbors that it's a good idea. So they might host a seminar to help educate people on the technology. So it's a bit more of a push channel for information pushing out, rather than a pull, where the online tools are more of a pull for information. So seminars are one thing, trade fairs as well, where you might interact with the companies there, back when we used to have trade fairs, I guess. And then you start getting into more advanced levels, where you have personal consultations with a supplier, and then you might get a quotation. So I say here 1 to 3 quotations, but the vast majority of the time it is one. And it is usually the one that your trusted peer recommended to you. And so there actually isn't that much comparison out in the real world, which, yeah, has its problems. And so I want to say that like the results I showed at a very high level are quite surprising, and I think do reveal a potential risk at an industry scale. But from a user perspective, it's also worth saying that no one is actually checking every online calculator except for dorks like me who obsess over this. So, but like I said, I think going from a different perspective, it's going to help us reveal sort of what the potential problem is with the information at large. And so we can ask the question, what are the purpose of these online tools? And my conclusion is that they're not necessarily meant to be educational. You know, I said the adoption process is very long, in part because people need to learn and become comfortable with the technology. But I don't know that these online tools are necessarily meant to be that most of the time. I think most of them are there because they're provided by companies. They're actually meant to be primarily lead generators. And so they look very good. They do provide some minimal amount of information, but ultimately in the end, they're meant to help grab a lead, grab a person's information and continue in the sales process. Most of the time, sales are done with personal consultations, and this makes sense as well, because it can be quite complicated understanding all the variables involved with any building product, you know, whether it's solar PV cells or new windows or a new heating system or a new roof or whatever it is that you're shopping for. Oftentimes, it's very difficult to make general assumptions. And so personal consultations are the norm. And then this also is good for the company because then they start building trust that way, rather than, so alternatively, you could think of these lead generators, you know, if they're not necessarily trying to build trust, they're just trying to splash information, and then you build the trust later on and then clarify some of the numbers that they may have seen in the online tool. And so again, coming back to this question of like, well, what's the risk? Like, what's the threat of this? Is this a bad system in some way? And not only do people get not that many quotations, so they're not comparing up front, there's also very little follow-up to sort of compare sort of what you were promised and what you're getting. So it's, which are also usually done in different places. So it's hard, like once you buy the system, it's like, is it doing what they said on the package? You know, it's hard to compare. So yeah, so this issue of comparison is a big one, and this is a news article. This is a researcher, Bengt Strid from Mälardalen University, who's worked with this issue for quite some time and had a project several years ago trying to sort of standardize the calculation process for providers. And so he has this article in SVT, which, you know, the issue here is that there's a risk that the quotes can become misleading. And so then we get back to this issue of trust where, you know, if we're not standardizing these things in some way, or at least providing a benchmark somewhere, there is a risk that for the industry as a whole, that you could have trust erosion. So you have, I mean, it starts very simply with 1 or 2 consumers who are unsatisfied with their system. But then as this spreads, then solar starts to become feeling more like a scam rather than a new product that's interesting to buy. This actually happened in the United States during the 1970s, during the oil crisis, where solar thermal collectors were a booming product and lots of people rushed into the space to take advantage of this new business opportunity, which led to a lot of bad actors, which led to a degradation of trust, amongst other political things that were going on at the time, but it caused it harmed the industry in a way. So we want to avoid this sort of, you know, we don't want to have short-term gain by capturing this boom while also sacrificing the long-term sort of trust and development of the industry as a whole. And so now we're getting to this question of how can we make this better? And so in our sort of development of our online tools in partnership with Karlstad and Terens, we have a few sort of core objectives that we're trying to keep in mind. So of course, I think as with anything online, you want to make it simple. You want to make it easy to use. So you want to minimize clicks, minimize requests for information from the user, particularly when they're critical to getting a good answer, which also ties into automation. So minimizing, again, sort of the need for the user to provide information that they don't actually necessarily know. And then, but this goes into multiple different layers, I guess, of this sort of analysis process, as well as then educate. And I put an asterisk next to it because it's not the classic term of educate. And I even decided whether or not that was the right word to put here. But we want people to walk away without too much effort. You want them to intuitively walk away with a fundamental understanding, a heuristic of a complex system, right? So it's sort of analogous to watching a documentary and and walking away with some knowledge that you've learned something without being tested on it, let's say. So, but simplified, easy to understand rules of thumb. At the same time, we want to shift our design intent away from capturing attention to informing, with a trust as the core aspect right up front. And so, again, part of our behavioral design approach is to leverage known biases. A lot of my time as a researcher has been spent doing very detailed and thorough calculations of economy and technique and all these things. But when it comes down to it, we can't flood the user with information or try and show them the right way to analyze it. We have to kind of meet them where they are. And so this has also informed the process quite a bit. And so this is a working prototype that we've got now with this particular one is from Karlstad. And so I'm gonna try and pause it like as we go here. So I don't know how much control I have over this. But basically the process here then with this solar map is you can type in your address or you select your roof. This will repeat as well. So I apologize for the speed with which this goes through. But you can click on your roof, you tell it how much energy you use. So it's only 2 inputs from the user side. Because it's built into a solar map, all of the solar analysis is done ahead of time. So we don't need to ask that additional information and lead to potentially unreasonable results. And then, like I said, with the energy is the only other complicated one that you have to enter. Once you get in there, then another thing that we've done to help automate this process is we've used we just got done with a master's thesis project where we took a bunch of simulated PV data and load data and have trained a machine learning regression model to predict self-consumption. So I really wish I could like pause this somehow. I didn't really think about that when I was putting this together. So one of the things that we really wanted to show people was sort of when you have a solar system on your roof, how much electricity goes to you and how much of it goes to the grid, because this is a growing issue, both from a technical and economic perspective. It also makes people feel good when they're using more of the electricity. So some of these results you see here where it shows you energy to the house versus energy to the grid, this is coming from this new regression model that we've trained. It also shows the user in more detailed sort of perspective, because one thing we found in our interviews is that people tend to latch on to specific moments, like today is a beautiful sunny day. And so people are, at least here in Stockholm, if you're sitting in Stockholm, it's a great day outside to talk about solar energy. But so people latch on to that and they think about it when they're sort of imagining how this system will work. So we're trying to at least get these high-level simulations to help represent that in some way. The other thing that we sort of stole from Energimyndigheten was this use of sliders. And so you can now dynamically change, like maybe I want a bigger system or a smaller system, and then you can see how that affects the design. We're also, this graph on the right here is representing payback time, and the recommendation given to the user is actually based on a minimized payback time that is designed for the load in the building, not necessarily just what's the biggest system I can put on the roof. So we're trying to do a little bit more personalized design process. Okay, so yeah, these are just a couple of sort of design features. And the uncertainty with dealing with uncertainty, one way is to sort of give people a chance to play with themselves, the inputs, and see how it affects the outputs. The approach that we're using at Tidens is slightly different. So here, they've actually adopted a Monte Carlo analysis that I developed during my PhD. And so they've actually recoded it and put it into their website. And so here, all of the uncertainties are actually captured in one analysis. And then you get this probability. So I apologize, this is in Swedish, but what you're seeing here then is sort of, in 92 out of 100 cases, your system will be profitable or economically successful, right? So people can, the idea here is to see if people feel secure, more secure to take the investment or take the price or take the cost of solar cells if they sort of have this type of information available to them. So this is something I've actually had trouble with for a long time, is trying to present this information in a good way, because Monte Carlo is very common in the financial world, but it's not very commonly used or understood by individuals like the average consumer. So this is a fun experiment to see if we can actually get there. Speaking of experiments, so how we're going to sort of know if we're doing this right, like our experimental process. So this is a snapshot of the Karlstad page. We're doing the same thing with Terens, but what we'll be doing is having, as users go to the site, they'll get randomly placed into 4 different alternatives for the site. And amongst these alternatives, the information and the analysis is all the same. So the calculations there are all the same, but what's different is how that information shows up. And so we'll be using different language in terms, this is a bad example just because there's nothing particularly interesting here. It just says calculate it yourself. Where like the economics, for example, are presented, it's really focused heavily on the economic side because that's where you have the most freedom. The behavioral economics field gives you a lot of freedom to try different techniques. When it comes to technical stuff, again, you're kind of limited, but we definitely take a language, a full approach from the entire website in terms of how the language is presented. And so we have different ways of talking about the information and the results. We have different ways of different KPIs, different performance indicators. So for example, if we want to use a cost forward approach, we might sort of talk about how much the system costs and how much you're going to save every year, versus more of an investment approach where you might talk about you frame this as an investment, and maybe you have a return, like an interest rate or return on investment that you're going to talk about. So we have different ways of framing this information. We're measuring this by sort of seeing how many people go forward in the process. So the idea here being that if we see an increased, click-through, user response, click-through rate, then that means that we're potentially doing something right within that particular website framing. And then we can also watch the behavior, like how users use the site. If we offer them information and they don't take it, then we know that maybe that's not as interesting for people. So, so this is also a way that we're measuring the websites. And going forward, so this is what we're doing now. I was hoping to have some information, or sorry, some initial results for this presentation. It's actually been surprisingly challenging to get these websites developed, both technically as well as legally, because GDPR makes it quite difficult to do this stuff. So, so we're getting quite close to having the websites launched. And so hopefully the next couple months we'll get there. So definitely stay tuned. And we also see sort of going forward that these maps have the potential to become a platform. So right now I've been talking largely about solar PV from the user's perspective, but a lot of the feedback that we've had is not only will users find this interesting, but also the sellers or the companies can find this quite interesting. So perhaps a salesperson is actually sitting down with the user together and they go through it. And talk about sort of the offer that way. There's actually a company in the US, they just closed a $100 million Series B round of funding that does exactly this, like very much what I'm showing you with the solar maps. That's exactly how they sell PV systems to customers, which has been very good for them during the pandemic when there's not so much one-on-one interaction. So as a platform for PV, I think the maps have a lot of potential to grow beyond even just this. We also have the potential to sort of automatically design systems inside these platforms as well. So you can, again, automating more and more of the process to make it simpler and faster. You could also imagine incorporating other technologies. So a really good one that people often latch on to once they've sort of thought about the PV is electric vehicles, which of course have a really high impact on the electricity use in a house. And so, so these two can oftentimes go together quite well. Again, depending on the situation, and sort of it can be kind of complicated. And so we could also potentially use these tools to help simplify and reduce the complication there. As Stacy mentioned in the intro, we do a lot of work with heat pumps. And so heating systems also could be another interesting way. If someone doesn't have a heat pump, this could be a way to sort of see how these two technologies work together. And now we start sort of edging out onto the boundaries of sort of a broader decision-making process. So, you know, the user, the homeowner, let's say, is trying to think about decisions they can take to improve their environmental footprint. And so solar is just one, electric vehicles are another, where they get the heat from is another. And so, you know, you can imagine this platform as being a place where you can sort of make holistic decisions about all of your energy needs in one place. And especially convenient if you have, I mean, obviously we all have limited budgets. And so if you've only got 100,000 crowns to spend and you can only do one of these things, well, it could be interesting to find out what which one is going to have the most impact on the metrics you care most about. Tied into this as well would also be building efficiency, which also gets extremely complicated. So I don't want to talk too much about that, just more of like an idea of like, oh yeah, you could also include, say, new windows as compared to PV. You know, that would be a nice you know, comparison to make. And then lastly, you can also imagine, this is again not so much of a user tool, this would be more of a commercial or professional tool of network effects. And so one thing we've talked about is if you know what the solar potential is of every building in a city, well then sellers like that, because then they can go after, they could use that as a way to contact customers directly. Grid companies could potentially think about this as a way to look for bottlenecks or stressors in the grid, that sort of thing. So a lot of potential there from a network effects standpoint as well. So to wrap up, I think I'm more or less okay on time. So to kind of wrap things up here, I think digitization of energy systems, it already has done a lot to simplify information delivery, but I think there's more potential to come. But I think it's important that we take the right focus for who the information is for and how we want to get it to them. And so for us, at least, you know, our focus is on user experience from the prosumer, from the homeowner's perspective, and what they need, less than, say, sort of what the needs of the company are that's actually providing this information. And again, you know, it makes a lot of sense why companies present the information that way, and I don't blame them for it. It's how the system works, but it's taking a step back and sort of trying to understand, is there a better way that the system can work as a whole if we redesign the way the information is being shared. And so I think what our work hopefully what our work can do is have impacts not only for the prosumers or the buyers of the PV, but also the companies selling it, and also even at the overall level of the industry. So with that, I will wrap it up, and let's see if there are any questions that people want to ask. So.